Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the witty and terrible literary escape room that is the Book Club Blind Entry podcast. My name is Casey, and I am your host. Every week, I read a book in its entirety and do research into the background of the book and its author. I then send my co-host a 10-page excerpt devoid of page numbers, a title, or the author. In the next 26 minutes or so, my co-host and I will try to reconcile our differing perspectives to see how much one socially distanced excerpt deviates from the meaning of the entire book. Today, my co-host is my Aunt Roxanne Eberle, who is also a professor of English at the University of Georgia. We conducted our podcast over Zoom, which explains the following audio quality. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
It's been a while since I've seen you.
Yeah, it's been a hot minute. I'm just curious, how intensely did you read that excerpt?
Oh, well, because I'm an English professor, I read it a lot. I read it, I think 3 times, probably.
Oh, wow.
Maybe more.
Mm-hmm. Did it carry any, connections to the genres of fiction that you normally read?
Yes, because I read really crazy broadly, which, for example, right now I'm reading a space opera by Lois McMaster-Bujold. I'm reading kind of like a Regency mystery, like in costume, 19th century. And I'm reading this really cool fantasy by an author named Zen Cho, The Sorcerer's Crown, I think, set in the Regency period, but it's a fantasy about magicians in England. And there's a African character, and I think her ethnicity hasn't been revealed yet, but I'm fairly sure her mother was Indian. Yeah, so I read really broadly. I have had a super long, it's past now, but I had a vampire period. I always say I'm more of a werewolf girl. And and of course, I've read all of the Harry Potter. So
yeah. The author of this text started writing it before the last Harry Potter was published, but she also claimed to not have read all of the books before she started.
Well, I mean, she certainly plays fast and loose with the plot, so that wouldn't be too surprising. I don't know if it's obviously fan fiction, and she's interested in taking it in the directions that are different from Harry Potter. Really interesting, given what's happening with J.K. Rowling, actually, that it is a fan fiction that so thoroughly embraces non-binary sexuality and
like her comments about transgender people.
Yeah. She's very upset, Layla, my daughter, and it surprises me less. So
actually, I just read an essay for this text claiming that it is a great literary work for feminism. This essay is available on the website Archive of Your Own, and it was written by Stone Age Woman. As always, this will be available in the description below. In today's pop culture world, that the author is sort of untouchable in regards to the other male characters. There's very rarely anyone who swoops in and save her, and she very much adopts the Harry Potter role in the narrative. And there's parts where male professors will come in and do things to her that are really disgusting, and she's like, oh, I took out my gun and I shot them a lot.
She's completely an empowered female figure.
Mm-hmm. In the whole thing, I don't know if you noticed, but she screams and she shouts a lot. Yeah. She'll open a door and just walk into class and start telling someone off because of how strongly she feels. Literally, she's not diminutive in any way. She's actually very rude.
The one thing I didn't understand is that each of the sections starts with AN and then a colon. Is that a text message or an email? What is that?
Here, I'm about to go off on how I don't know what this is, and it is true that I was not able to find answers in the sources that I looked through. However, my friend suggested that this could be author's note, which makes a lot of sense to me. No one knows what the ANs are. I've read the Wikipedia page. I've read a really famous article talking about it. There's a whole fan wiki devoted to analyzing all of the characters and the different parts of the text to see how much meaning they can pull out from it. No one knows what the ANs are. They read kind of as asterisks, and I read them kind of as asterisks. It's like a constant writer's note throughout each upload. And this author actually, once the fan fiction started gaining traction, she was receiving anywhere up to 10,000 hateful comments. So those asterisks actually became a major way for her to respond and also to fight back against all of the hate that she was receiving. Listeners can read more about this on the article by Abraham Riesman that's available on Vulture and Slate.
So
I don't
this
know.
is the original Mary Sue. This is not a fan fiction, because I know there's a famous fan fiction called Mary Sue, right? I don't know that much about it, but I'm assuming, is this
Oh,
it?
no, this is not it. This is an example of Mary Sue.
So where was it published? Can I know that now? Which
Yes.
fan fiction site was it on?
This was published on fanfiction.net between
Mm.
2006 and 2007.
So that it also was bringing in all the Harry Potter fan fiction. Is Willow from Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Does she import other characters from other?
Yes, she does. She imports Marty McFly from another movie at some point.
Yeah,
And
that's Back to the Future. That's weird. I don't get that.
yes. Well, she tries to incorporate Marty McFly into the Time Turner segment. So
Yeah,
Marty McFly is there and he's goth and his car is black.
that's
He
cool.
helps her travel around. And at one point, she escapes the past with Voldemort in the car and shows up back with the younger version of Voldemort to fight the older version of Voldemort.
And the DeLorean. The Time Turner is actually pretty early, Casey. I think that's 3. That's The Prisoner of Azkaban.
Oh no, you're right. You're right.
Yeah.
Yes, that is the Prisoner of Azkaban. You're totally right.
That is so cool. But Marty McFly is kind of like a Harry Potter. I mean,
Yeah.
very similar.
But one thing that I found really fascinating about this whole thing was in its feminism. You could read it as a tribute to the original Dracula as a feminist work.
Yeah. So I started thinking about that too. And have you ever read Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu?
I have not.
Okay, so that's considered the original female lesbian vampire story. It predates Stoker by about 20 years. And do you know about the original vampire, which is by Polidori?
No.
Okay, so the first telling of the vampire myth, and this does get into my area of specialty because I'm a romancist, so that's the era of Byron. During the summer of 1816 is when Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein. It's also the summer that she spent with Byron, and at that point, her lover, they weren't married yet, in Switzerland. And Byron's doctor, who most assume was also his lover, contributed a short story called The Vampire, Vampyr. And that's actually the first example of the vampire myth being turned into a story that appears in England. And so really the roots of the vampire myth are very much gender, non-binary, and queer. The lines in the story, the pages you gave me about, bisexuals being hot and sensitive is really very interesting in terms of its romantic history, which is a history of queer love in some ways. I'd say it goes back further even than Dracula, but you're right, like that Minute character in Bram Stoker's Dracula is definitely someone who needs to be rescued from silence and obscurity. Although other critics, and I always tend to be sympathetic for this kind of feminist reading, kind of think of the ways in which she's empowered as the typist, as the one who actually records the story.
It's so interesting thinking about how those relations have extended so far back through history and how much we can comfortably infer about what this author is consciously doing.
Or unconsciously.
Or unconsciously. Like, can we say that she knew that a vampire is a historical tool for transgressing gender conventions and extending feminism? Would she know that? And what's interesting to me is that I took a lot of her misspellings or her phonetic spellings, as the Wikipedia page calls it, to be intentional. She says duh instead of the a lot. In several points, she demonstrates that she knows how to spell 3-letter words. This repeats also, especially for characters' names. And there are points in which the characters' names are spelled correctly. So she always has a choice to go back and spell the characters' names however she wants. But if you think about this as this feminist and transgressive text in which she is the absolute source of power in relation to the rest of the characters, the fact that she's constantly referring to them in different ways, seems like a way of reinforcing her relative power over them. Like, I'll call you whatever you want, whatever I want.
Well, and there's two other literary traditions that you could say are going on.
Yeah.
One is like just postmodern playfulness, like wordplay, which is really something that's typical in something like Pynchon, like The Crime of Lot 49. I don't know if you've read any postmodern fiction. It also plays fast and loose with spelling as a way of powerful play with a purpose that shows that kind of dominance over language and thus like agency. But the other tradition I was really thinking about, because you asked me to think about different literary traditions, is the tradition of using vernacular and dialect. I don't know what if the character is supposed to be American or British, but sometimes it really reads like Cockney dialect. Like when she says nothing, that's a real kind of classic spelling of nothing for the Cockney dialect, which is interesting in terms of just the Harry Potter model of the privileged, private school kind of situation. So I was kind of thinking it that way, both as play, because there's that one moment in the segment you gave me where she spells maybe sporadically correctly or sadistically, and the character says something like, see, I know how to spell that correctly. It's clearly deliberate. So Snape is snap or snake. They all have kind of resonances. Lupin is spelled Loopin. All that kind of playfulness. It's also just something about fan fiction that my students actually, my English majors, have a hard time getting their head around, is the rules are different for fan fiction. It's a genre that privileges that playfulness and doesn't demand the kind of proofreading that a student turning in a formal paper or publishing with Random House or Penguin would be held to. So that's what makes me think it's in that kind of postmodern, no holds barred tradition, because that's different from fan fiction where it's just kind of like, I'm not going to proofread and I'm not going to spell check. This felt really deliberate to me. So I think you're absolutely right.
It's so interesting that she refuses to go back and implement any sort of uniformity over her text. And what
Yeah.
I really like about this is that the feminism of it and the personal empowerment of it is only amplified by how much hate she was constantly getting. This is 44 chapters long or so. Normal fan fictions, at least for fanfiction.net, would not go over like 6 or 7 chapters, and they were very short at that. So I read a very famous article for this. It was written by a guy named Abraham Riesman, and he actually lays out a lot of the context for this fanfiction. And he said that it attracted the attention that it did because it was so long. She kept going. You could not stop her. She only stopped after a certain point just because it became too much, but she got really far before that. And she did so well that there was like a whole enclave of online kind of like internet pirates and social media hackers. They did not really have very moral values. A few people hacked her account and wrote these very satirical and correctly spelled chapters to finish off the text. And it's included now in the canon version. So you get through like chapters 1 through 39 or 38, and then you read 3 different versions of the same chapter that have all been written by different people, and then you get a final chapter that ends with her screaming Avada Kedavra. At that point, the language is so close to the first 39 chapters that you're not sure whether it's her or whether it's someone who's impersonating her. And there's been like multiple claims to authorship over this text. We don't know exactly who wrote it because of how many different disputes there are. Someone actually tried to publish a memoir about writing it who didn't actually write it.
Oh, I do remember reading about that.
You did?
What is the name of this?
The Search for My Brother, the true story of My Immortal or something. It was written by
My Immortal. Yeah. I read an article about the memoir thing. When I teach my Jane Austen course, we have a fan fiction component. And so I was prepping for that course and was reading around. So I read that about the person who wanted to be the writer of My Immortal producing this memoir.
Yeah, it's super weird. It's so cool that you identified that the use of K in so many of the different words could imply a Cockney accent, because the original author claimed to be living in Dubai, which is in the United Arab Emirates, very, very far away. Riesman discusses this as part of the author's background. This idea that she could have actually been like a Cockney British teenager, maybe 12 or 13, living in England at the time that this is written, is an intriguing idea. That is so interesting. I wanted to ask, because this is a very famous question of debate for specifically this text, because this text transgresses so many cliche tropes of fan fiction that really hardcore fan fiction fans hate. There's been a lot of discussion as to whether that transgression is genuine or whether it is purposefully created. Whether a young girl of 12 to 13 created this out of her fantasy and this is a reflection of her like innermost wants and desires, or whether this is like a 17-year-old woman who's taking this deeply convoluted and satirical approach to a 44-page fan fiction.
I'm never going to underestimate the ability of a 13 or 14-year-old. If they've done a huge amount of reading, the only reason why I'd be tempted to think it's someone slightly older who's read more is just how well the dialogue is done formally. But I don't know. I think a really talented 13 or 14-year-old could absolutely do it. Say they've been reading fan fiction since they were really little. That's kind of one of the things I love about fan fiction is that you don't know and you can speculate. I can see it being produced, frankly, by like a 40-year-old woman who is, playing with all of the conventions. So when's My Chemical Romance popular? Isn't My Chemical Romance popular like in the 80s, right? I mean, that seems like really early Gothic punk. Like Green Day is cited. So Green Day would make like maybe somebody about your age, a little older.
That was referenced when they go back in time, I believe.
Well, and at one point in the section I read, she says somebody's hot, like Billy Joe Armstrong.
Is that from Green Day?
Yeah, he's the lead singer.
My Chemical Romance was founded in 2001.
Oh, so it's later than I thought.
Immediately following 9/11.
But it's harkening back to 80s Billy Idol kind of stuff. The guy's really doing a Billy Idol impersonation. So that means it would be somebody about your age, maybe a little older, like somebody's like 25, 26, if it was a young person. But that makes me think they probably were. So when was it written? How many years ago?
Like it started to get written in 2006 and then it finished in 2007 because the author kept on going on hiatus to do things.
Right. That would make me think it was someone who probably was between the years of like 13 and 19 when they wrote it. I mean, that's one thing that English professors pay attention to, right? Our illusions. And then we go back and try to make sense of the text via those illusions. I mean, think about the Brontes. They wrote amazing fiction when they were really young. Jane Austen's Juvenilia, it's where she didn't follow any of the rules that she later makes her own. I absolutely think it could have been a young person, but that person is extremely gifted, whoever it was, with dialogue. I think that's what I would say. What strikes me as formally really sophisticated, that's hard to do. Dialogue's hard to write.
It is. It's super hard. Good dialogue is really hard. I think in his memoir, Stephen King actually starts to rant a little bit about that, about writing good dialogue, and I got a few tips actually from how he approaches it. But it's so cool that you bring up Jane Austen because I was thinking about that as I was reading this text, in that the characters are so dramatized and it's almost one or two dimensional, that it almost carries these layers of this Jane Austen like satire of character fiction where they just stand in their own contradictions for the sake of it. And you just pay attention to their contradictions and interpret it as like a condition of being a human being. Also, to add insight as to whether this is genuine or contrived, the people who hacked into her account and found all of her login information tracked her down and did a ton of research on her internet persona and found a bunch of her other accounts. So, like, she had like a MySpace account and another account. And that's where they found out her actual name. And that's where she found out that she's claiming to be living in Dubai. And she wrote in a very similar dialect with very similar spelling as when she was writing My Immortal. So I have to assume that some of this is at least genuine. I mean, it's totally possible that this could be even a mixture of intentional satire and genuine desire. Like, you could consider that she would purposefully be writing Mary Sue fiction with all these abhorrent tropes with purposeful phonetic spelling in order to anger the preps, so to speak, because she is constantly attacking them in her comments. And she has a character in the fan fiction named Brittany, who she's always trashing. And she's like, Brittany sucks because she's a prep. You could approach this in how it transgresses everything as like a purposeful stick it up to like the preps that she genuinely hates. It's almost
Yeah,
Satanism as this subversive belief system and religion in itself.
absolutely. I think it can be genuine and contrived at exactly the same time. I mean, that genuine kind of, say we do imagine it's by a 13 or 14-year-old. I mean, you can have some genuine rage and anger. I mean, I think maybe that's when some people are the angriest. But those genuinely angry, subversive people can be quite clever and deliberate in the way in which they kind of say F you to the authorities and to preps and also conventions. I mean, and it really is clever because fan fiction prides itself on unconventional breaking boundaries. And then this text comes in and shows just how contrived the rules of fan fiction are, that fan fiction rebels also self-police and self-monitor. This fan fiction is having none of that.
I also interpreted it as a sort of medieval text. I don't know if you've ever read Thomas of Elderfield.
No, that one, you got me on that one.
Okay. It's like this text written in the 1300s. I got to read it for AP European history and I've never forgotten it. He enters a duel over a dispute and then has his testicles cut off. And there's descriptions of like children like playing with his testicles in the field and he has his eyes gouged out. And then a saint comes later in the story and replaces both of them. And the local community is so amazed that they have like the archbishop and a bunch of these church authorities come to ascertain that he was actually blessed by saints and that his organs are actually holy relics. So there's this description of, this is in the 1300s, when like the church has this like very strong grip on certain regions of Europe where an archbishop is kneeling down and like touching his testicles to make sure they're real. And it's so just absolutely violates everything that you would expect about traditional fiction. And the base for Christian faith is that now we interpret so many different religions and different sections of Christianity is so rigid, when really the origins for these types of belief systems were just all over the place. And in that way, this fanfiction reads as primal and pure reaction to her surroundings in a way similar to that, where she's not trying to necessarily theorize or conform to any abstract thought patterns. She's like, I'm angry. This is how I feel. I'm reacting directly to this, and this.
Yeah. I mean, I really like that connection to kind of medieval miracle plays or saint stories. You're right. I mean, they're absolutely out there. And this is something that the church really didn't like, right? And wanted to clean up in order to control and regulate.
Yeah.
And at the same time, there were other points in the church's history, like in the Renaissance period, where there's a real resistance to educating the masses, like not wanting them to be able to read the Bible, preferring to keep them in superstition, thinking that it was easier to control. And of course, failing, because under control, over control, the masses and that anger is always going to come up to the surface.
And maybe that's what both of these texts, Thomas of Elderfield and this new fan fiction, and maybe even Jane Austen and the Brontes and Byron, anyone who ever transgressed boundaries, maybe that's why this holds its appeal, is the unabashed breaking of the rules and this very raw reaction and this sense of power for the sake of power.
I mean, that's why I think that's exactly what the postmodern impulse is in terms of literature. And that really struck me while I was reading this in a way, because postmodernism, unlike, say, Austen, who is so controlled in the way in which she breaks boundaries, this has that kind of lack of control in breaking the boundaries. And yet it really does have like a plot. It uses plot in really deliberate ways. Byron is an interesting comparison because Byron's longest work, it's a long epic poem called Don Juan, in which he has this multi-persona. And he meant to start it off using epic frame. It was only supposed to be 12 books, like the Iliad. And instead, he couldn't stop writing it. and he just kept writing it and writing it. So like the books start having a life of its own. He publishes it as he writes it, and it only stops because he dies. And so that's kind of another really interesting connection to this, and shows you, I mean, one thing that historians of fan fiction are always trying to do is to find like the first fan fiction. And of course they can't, because you can never trace origins. But this is a really interesting text. In fact, I usually do teach, I've thought about doing an entire fan fiction course, and this would definitely be something, My Immortal would be something you'd want to do in that class.
Well, if you would like to do that, I actually have the name of a professor at Princeton University who has already done that and also is teaching My Immortal as a core text. And she thinks, like you, that this is a brilliant work of writing.
Who is it at Princeton?
Anne Jameson. She wrote a book called Thick, which you also might want to read, where she outlines a lot of the structures and the movements that were forming fan fiction kind of like through the ages.
That's great. I don't know that text. I'll have to check it out. I did do a fan fiction element with Frankenstein when I taught 1102, which is like the second semester writing requirement at the University of Georgia. So we read some Harry Potter fan fiction, but we never got to My Immortal.
It's a shame. I would assume that a lot of your students probably already know about it because of how renowned this is. Just one last thing I want to ask you as to our surprising appreciation for a fan fiction that has been lauded for its terribleness, ironically. I wanted to ask about whether our ability to attribute so many really cool and intelligent conventional methods to this text would imply that there are other authors who have written more critical works who have been credited for things that they weren't consciously doing.
So this is like just a huge question in literary studies, right? And so the question of value and what's terrible and what's good has been a way to really disempower, in particular, women's writing from the margins. And so I'm always deeply suspicious of that. I think there's all kinds of worth. I mean, as far as I'm concerned as a literary critic, I'm writing a biography of a woman writer who's not considered to be a quote unquote great writer. I find her writing to be really fascinating. I think it reveals things and is productive of interpretation. So I guess my stance is if a text can generate really fascinating, interesting, and ongoing engagement, that's a text of value. And that's old school feminist aesthetics. If it's valuable in a way that gets us to think about gender, if it gets us to think about agency, and as a literary critic, language and structure, then that's a text of value. So that would be my approach to the text. So I like lots of quote unquote bad writing. It's not bad if it generates a thoughtful interrogation of itself, of culture, of yourself. That's what's valuable in a text, any kind of text, a song, a fan fiction, a quote unquote great work of literature.
So you would say that the text comes before the author in that sense?
I think it's really useful. And I'm someone who's writing a biography, who always read biographies, who likes to know biographical fact. And yet I think it's really important for us always to be able to separate out the text from the biography. I think we get so much interesting information when we do that. So I always try to do that. I always try to keep in mind the text as a separate object than the biography, even as I really appreciate biography and what it gives us.
All right. Well, I would really like to thank you, Aunt Roxanne. Thank you so much for indulging me in reading this fan fiction. I'm glad you've already heard of it. I wanted to ask one last thing. Do you think you're going to read this entire thing now?
I don't know. I would have if you hadn't told me it's 44 chapters. That's long for fan fiction. I probably will, because now I'm curious about it. I'll probably definitely look at that Anne Jameson book. Right now, I have, very weirdly for me, I'm usually a one book person, but I'm reading somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4 books right now. I think it's just like summer craziness.
Yeah.
But I'm reading the 2 I mentioned, and then I'm reading Curtis Sittenfeld wrote a book called Rodham, which I understand imagines Hillary Rodham Clinton's life as though she does not marry Bill Clinton. So I'm reading that. And then I'm also reading some literary criticism. And so I don't know. Sure, I'd probably add another thing. at this point. You just keep adding things.
It won't take you that long. I mean, the chapters are not that long at all. I read it in 2 sittings, pretty fast. All right. Thank you so much, Aunt Roxanne. I will
Thank you,
talk to you
Casey.
soon. All right, everyone. This has been Book Club Blind Entry. Thank you so much for listening, and I will see you all next week with a new co-host.